Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be exploring this idea of condoning behavior. It's something we all do probably without even realizing it.
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about this topic is how it really touches on everything from our personal relationships to like even societal norms.
Yeah.
It's a pretty broad concept.
Yeah, and the source material we've got for this one is really fascinating.
That's right.
It jumps right into this question of like, what are all the different ways we condone things without even realizing it? And that got me thinking, we often focus on the big, obvious examples of condoning, like, maybe overlooking some serious wrongdoing or something. But what about all those everyday actions, the subtle things that we do that might actually reinforce behaviors we don't even necessarily agree with?
It's like we have these blind spots, and I think it's because as humans, we just naturally want to avoid conflict. So we tend to just overlook or downplay anything that kind of disrupts that, sense of harmony we want to have.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. And that actually leads perfectly into the second question that the source material brings up, which is this idea of small mistakes in relationships. Can they snowball into bigger problems if we ignore them? And the source actually uses this phrase that really stuck with me. It talks about these like flimsy instant gratifications. Have you ever found yourself doing that, like trying to smooth things over with a quick fix instead of actually addressing the root cause of a problem?
Oh, all the time.
Oh,
I think it's so easy to fall into that trap,
yeah,
especially in relationships. You just want to keep the peace.
exactly.
But the thing is, these flimsy instant gratifications, they actually become a way of condoning the behavior, even if we're not doing it intentionally. It's almost like we're saying, okay, this time it's fine, but then that can easily turn into a pattern. And there's actually a lot of research on this. Dr. John Gottman, he's like a leading expert in relationships. And his research shows that these unresolved issues, even small ones, they can trigger what he calls negativity bias in our brains.
Negativity bias, what's that?
It's like this thing where our brains basically start fixating on the problem.
Yeah.
And so it creates this like undercurrent of tension. And that impacts the relationship, even if you're not actively fighting about it.
So it's not just about sweeping things under the rug. It's actually affecting us like on a neurological level.
Yeah. Pretty powerful stuff to think about.
Wow. Okay, so we've talked about avoiding conflict and how that can lead to condoning. But the source material also dives into this really interesting distinction between tolerance and enabling. And it basically argues that tolerance is okay as long as the person who's doing whatever it is, they're aware that it's not ideal. But they're not like, seriously harming themselves or other people. They use this example of like the terrible singer we all know one, right?
Yeah.
Someone who loves to sing but is completely tone deaf. Like it's harmless enough. Their joy outweighs the, let's say, uniqueness of their voice.
Oh, I know exactly the type. I think we all have that one friend or family member.
Right, but what happens when it's not so harmless? How do we know where to draw the line between tolerance and enabling?
That's where boundaries come in. And this isn't just about romantic relationships or anything. It applies to our work, our friendships, how we interact with like society as a whole even. It really requires us to ask ourselves some tough questions. Like, what are my non-negotiables? Where's that line where someone's behavior crosses over and I can't just passively accept it anymore?
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough question to answer, especially because, like you were saying earlier, we tend to shy away from conflict as humans.
Exactly. But it's so important to remember that boundaries aren't about like controlling other people. It's about protecting ourselves. And communication is key. When we're able to clearly communicate our boundaries to others, we're being proactive about, preventing ourselves from condoning something that ultimately could be harmful to us.
It's like setting those expectations up front, right? So we've talked about how avoiding conflict can lead to condoning. We've talked about those flimsy instant gratifications. But the source also brings up another really interesting aspect of this whole thing, which is the power of silence.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah. And they use this phrase that I thought was really powerful. They call it the silent killer.
Ooh, I like that.
It's this idea that when we stay silent about something that's bothering us, it can actually be interpreted as agreement, even if that's not what we mean at all.
That happens all the time, right?
Yeah, and so it's like we're passively condoning the behavior just by not speaking up. But the source points out that that silence can actually breed resentment and erode trust over time.
Which makes total sense if you think about it. It's like
Yeah.
that thing that keeps building up inside you until you just can't hold it in anymore.
Exactly.
So I think it's really important to be able to differentiate between, choosing your battles wisely and using silence as a coping mechanism. Because if something is genuinely important to us, we need to find a way to communicate our concerns in a constructive way.
Yeah, it sounds like a delicate balance. Makes you
Sure.
think, What have I been staying silent about? And what's the cost of that silence?
Right. What are we letting slide that we really shouldn't be? And, this whole idea of condoning, it's not just about how we interact with other people.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, we can also condone things within ourselves.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
Well, think about it like those negative self-talk patterns we all have.
Oh, yeah.
Those moments where your inner critic is just like, you're not good enough, or you'll never be able to do that.
Oh, I know those voices all too well. It's like they're on repeat sometimes.
Exactly. And when we let those thoughts just run wild without challenging them, it's like we're condoning them. It's as if we're saying, yeah, you're right, inner critic. I'm a failure.
Wow, that's a powerful way to put it. So it's like we're enabling our own self-sabotage by giving those negative thoughts permission to just take over.
Exactly. And that self-condoning it can really impact our self-esteem, our motivation, our overall well-being. Think about it. If you're constantly telling yourself you're not good enough, how likely are you to actually take risks or go after your goals?
Yeah, probably not very likely. But the good news is the source material doesn't just point out the problem, right? It offers some solutions too.
Absolutely. The key, they say, is self-awareness. We need to start paying attention to those negative thought patterns and then challenge them when they pop up. Instead of just blindly accepting them as truth, we need to question their validity. Ask ourselves, is this thought really true? What evidence do I have to support this?
So it's like becoming our own inner advocate, questioning those negative stories we tell ourselves and not letting them dictate our actions.
Exactly. It's almost like we need to retrain our brains to focus on the positive.
Yeah, instead of getting stuck in that negativity loop.
Right. And the source material actually highlights some techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT they call it. And it really emphasizes this idea of reframing those negative thoughts. So instead of saying, I'm a failure, you might say, okay, I made a mistake, but that's okay. I can learn from this.
It's a subtle shift, but I can see how it could make a big difference.
It really can.
But I imagine it takes practice, right? I mean, these negative thought patterns can be so ingrained.
It definitely does take time and effort. And that's where self-compassion comes in. The source material really emphasizes that we need to be kind to ourselves throughout this process, recognizing that we're all works in progress, that setbacks are inevitable. Instead of beating ourselves up for our mistakes, we can choose to view them as opportunities for growth.
Yeah, that's a much healthier perspective. So we've talked about how condoning can show up in our relationships through things like those flimsy gratifications and our silence. And we've also talked about how it can manifest within ourselves through that negative self-talk. It seems like awareness is a really key theme here.
Absolutely. And that awareness needs to extend beyond our individual actions too. The source material also talks about the broader societal implications of condoning. They pose this really interesting question. What are we collectively condoning as a society?
Oh, that is a deep question. What are some examples of that, like societal condoning?
Well, it could be anything from turning a blind eye to injustices to passively accepting harmful stereotypes or normalizing behaviors that go against our values. For example, think about how often we just scroll past news stories about social issues without taking any action, or how we might laugh at a joke that perpetuates a harmful stereotype even though deep down we know it's wrong. These seemingly small acts can contribute to a culture of condoning.
Yeah, it's like we're collectively sweeping things under the rug on a societal level.
Exactly. And that's where the source material challenges us to consider our role in either perpetuating or challenging these norms. It's about asking ourselves, what am I willing to tolerate and what am I willing to stand against?
So it's not just about personal growth, it's about using that awareness to make a positive impact on the world around us.
Right. And this actually ties back to the concept of boundaries we talked about earlier. Just like we need to establish personal boundaries, we also need to be mindful of those societal boundaries. What are we collectively willing to accept? And what lines are we not willing to cross as a society?
It's a lot to think about, and I'll be honest, it's making me rethink some of my own behaviors and choices.
I think that's the beauty of these deep dives. They challenge our assumptions and push us to consider new perspectives.
They definitely do. Okay, so we've covered condoning in relationships, self-condoning, and even societal condoning. It's a lot to digest. But where do we go from here? What are some practical takeaways for our listeners?
So much to unpack here, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about those big, obvious things like we think of. It's those small, everyday things, the actions and the inactions that really make a difference in the long run.
And it's so interesting. This deep dive has really made us think about how we condone behavior in others, but also how we condone things within ourselves. And as a society, it's really multifaceted.
It is. So as we wrap things up here, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can they do with all this information? I think the most important thing is awareness. We can't change what we don't acknowledge. So the first step is just being more mindful of our behaviors, our choices. Paying attention to those moments where we might be condoning something that goes against our values or, that isn't good for us.
It's like shining a light on those blind spots we were talking about earlier, right?
Exactly. And once we're aware of those patterns, then we can start setting some boundaries. And this applies to our relationships, our workplaces, how we interact with society, even our relationship with ourselves.
Yeah.
Boundaries are not about controlling other people, though it's about defining what's acceptable to us and communicating that.
Protecting ourselves, making sure our actions match our values. But communicating those boundaries, that can be tough sometimes, right? Especially when it could lead to conflict.
True, but the source material emphasizes that communication doesn't have to be confrontational. It can be as simple as saying, hey, I'm not comfortable with that, or I disagree with that. Just asserting our needs and opinions in a respectful way.
And sometimes it might even mean removing ourselves from a situation or a relationship that isn't respecting those boundaries.
Absolutely. Sometimes that's the healthiest choice.
So we've got awareness, boundaries, communication. Anything else we should add to our condoning toolkit here?
I think the final piece is action. Awareness, boundaries, communication, they're all important. But they're only effective if we actually act on them, making those choices that align with our values and addressing the things we're not willing to condone anymore.
Not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, right?
Exactly. And remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. It takes time, patience, and self-compassion.
Yeah, so important to remember that we're going to mess up, we're going to have setbacks, but it's about seeing those as opportunities to learn and grow.
And don't be afraid to ask for help along the way, too. Whether it's from friends, family therapists, online communities, having that support system can make a huge difference.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've learned so much about condoning, how it shows up in our personal lives and in society as a whole.
It's been a really great deep dive, and I hope our listeners are leaving with a better understanding of how to identify and address condoning in their own lives.
Me too. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you and with all our listeners today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.